Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1.
The letter arrived quietly, without sirens, without warning, without the chaos that would soon follow. In December 1999, inside the busy city of Lahore, a confession surfaced that would shake Pakistan to its core. It was not a rumor whispered in dark alleys, not a suspect dragged in by force, but a calculated, chilling admission written by a man who calmly claimed responsibility for the unimaginable. The letter was sent not only to the police but also to a prominent newspaper editor, Kawar Naeem Hashmi, as if the author wanted the world to bear witness. Inside it, the writer declared that he had raped and murdered 100 boys, 100 lives, 100 families, 100 futures erased, and he wrote it as if he were closing a chapter of a completed mission. The man behind the letter was Javed Iqbal, born into what many would describe as a respectable, even privileged household. He was the sixth of 8 children of a businessman father and grew up in Lahore, a city known for its culture, history, and vibrant life. He attended Government Islamia College as an intermediate student and, by 1978, while still young, had already started a steel recasting business. On the surface, he appeared industrious and capable. His father had even purchased a villa for him in the Altar area of the city, where he lived surrounded not by family, but by boys who shared the residence with him. To outsiders, it may have looked like generosity or mentorship. But behind the closed doors of that villa, something far darker was unfolding. Throughout the 1990s, as Lahore expanded and modernized, its streets were also home to countless vulnerable children, runaways, orphans, boys abandoned or forced to survive alone. They were invisible to most of society, surviving in markets, bus stations, and roadside shelters.
According to Iqbal's own confession, these were the children he targeted. Boys between the ages of 6 and 16. Children who had no one looking for them, no one powerful enough to demand justice. He would lure them in with promises of food, shelter, or money. For a child sleeping on concrete, even the smallest kindness can feel like salvation. But for many of them, stepping inside that villa would be the last decision they ever made. In his letter, Iqbal described the murders with horrifying detail. After sexually assaulting the boys, he claimed he strangled them using a chain. The brutality did not end there. He wrote that he dismembered their bodies and used vats of hydrochloric acid to dissolve the remains. Once the bodies were reduced, he emptied the acid into a local river, erasing physical traces of the crime. The method was systematic, calculated, repeated again and again until the number, according to him, reached 100. He documented everything. Names, ages, photographs, like trophies of a mission he believed he had completed. When police entered his house after receiving the letter, the scene inside was beyond disturbing. Bloodstains marked the walls and floors. The chain he claimed to have used lay inside. Photographs of young boys were found carefully stored in plastic bags, each labeled with handwritten notes listing names and ages. It was not chaotic. It was organized. Intentional. 2 large vats containing partially dissolved human remains were left behind deliberately. A note stated that he had not disposed of those particular bodies, so authorities would find them. It was as if he wanted proof of his actions discovered, verified, and remembered. One of the most chilling parts of the case was his journal. In it, he recorded his crimes like entries in a ledger. In one final entry, he wrote that his count had reached 100. He described the last victim as a handsome 16-year-old boy who had come from Peshawar. He wrote that with the grace of God, his mission was complete. Tears, he claimed, rolled down his cheeks. He stated he would ensure that his mission and his message reached the world. It was not remorse in the traditional sense. It was satisfaction. In the same letter, Iqbal declared that with his crimes complete, he planned to drown himself in the Ravi River. Police immediately began dragging the river with nets, searching for his body. When it did not surface, panic spread. If he was alive, he was still out there. authorities launched what became one of the largest manhunts in Pakistani history. Fear rippled across Lahore. Parents tightened their grip on their children. The reality that a serial killer had operated unnoticed for years created national outrage. Soon, 4 teenage boys who had shared Iqbal's flat were arrested in Sohawa. They were believed to be accomplices. Within days, one of them died in police custody. Officials claimed he had jumped from a window, but a post-mortem suggested force had been used against him. The case was becoming more complicated, layered with allegations not only of monstrous crimes, but also of possible misconduct within the system investigating them. The question that haunted everyone was why? Why 100? Why children? In his confession, Iqbal claimed his motive was rooted in revenge. Years earlier, in 1990s, he had been arrested on charges related to sodomy involving a young runaway boy. During that incident, the victim had reportedly attacked him, beating him severely, especially on the head, leaving him unconscious. Though formal charges were not ultimately pursued, the scandal damaged him socially and economically. He claimed his mother was forced to watch his decline, his humiliation, his loss of status. According to him, she suffered a fatal heart attack as a result of the stress. In his twisted reasoning, he wrote that her death had unleashed a hell within him. He resolved, he claimed, to make 100 mothers suffer the same pain he believed his own mother had endured. He would take 100 sons. He would cause 100 families to cry. It was revenge not against a system, not against specific individuals, but against innocent children who represented vulnerability itself. His logic was distorted, but in his mind, it was a mission. On December 30th, 1999, nearly a month after the confession letter was sent, Iqbal walked into the offices of the Daily Jang newspaper and turned himself in. He said he feared for his life and believed the police might kill him. By surrendering publicly, he ensured attention, visibility, and perhaps protection. He was arrested immediately. The trial that followed was swift and emotionally charged. Courtrooms were filled with grieving parents, journalists, and a nation desperate for justice. When the judge announced the sentence, it was as dramatic as the crimes themselves. Iqbal was sentenced to death. The judge declared that he would be strangled to death in front of the parents of the children he had killed, and that his body would then be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid, mirroring his own methods. It was a statement of fury as much as it was a verdict. However, Pakistan's interior minister at the time clarified that such punishments were not permissible under human rights commitments. The sentence would not be carried out in that theatrical manner. But the story did not end in the courtroom. On October 9, 2001, inside Kot Lakhpat jail in Lahore, Javed Iqbal and one of his accomplices, Sajid Ahmed, were found dead in their cells. Officials ruled that they had hanged themselves using bedsheets. Yet autopsies revealed they had been beaten prior to death. Questions arose immediately. Was it suicide? Vigilante justice? Custodial killing? For many of the victims' families, it felt like an incomplete ending. There was no public execution, no final confrontation, no closure. Iqbal's body went unclaimed. The emotional impact of the case cannot be measured in headlines. For the families, especially those who had spent years not knowing what happened to their sons, the truth was both a relief and a devastation. Some finally understood why their children never returned home. Others struggled with the reality that their sons' final moments were filled with fear and betrayal. The case also exposed uncomfortable truths about society's neglect of street children. These boys had been vulnerable long before they met their killer. Poverty, abandonment, and systemic indifference made them easy targets years later. The story resurfaced in popular culture with the release of a film titled Javed Iqbal, the untold story of a serial killer in 2023. The film focused on the trial and surrounding controversy. Initially scheduled for release in January 2022, it faced a ban from the Punjab government and the Central Board of Film Censors due to concerns about its portrayal of authorities. After public backlash and support from actors and audiences, it was eventually released in June 2023. The debate surrounding the film reflected how deeply the case still unsettled the nation. The story of Javed Iqbal is not only about a serial killer. It is about the invisible children of a city. It is about institutional failures. It is about how anger, humiliation, and twisted revenge can evolve into unimaginable brutality when left unchecked. It forces society to confront difficult questions about how many warning signs were ignored, how many missing children reports were dismissed, and how easily vulnerable lives can disappear without immediate alarm. And as disturbing as this case is, it remains a reminder that evil does not always hide in darkness. Sometimes it lives in ordinary houses, in familiar neighborhoods, behind doors that seem unremarkable from the outside. The most terrifying part is not only what he did, but how long he was able to do it. Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? And what more should be done to protect vulnerable children from becoming invisible victims? Subscribe for more deep, detailed true crime stories where we uncover not just the crime, but the truth behind it. Case 2 on March 7th, 1964, in the remote industrial city of Norilsk in Siberia, Mikhail Popkov was born into what appeared to be an ordinary Soviet family. Norilsk was known for its freezing temperatures, harsh working conditions, and isolated atmosphere, but his childhood there was brief. Soon, his parents moved to Angarsk in the Irkutsk region, a quieter industrial town surrounded by forests and long winter nights. Angarsk was the kind of place where people trusted their neighbors and respected authority, especially the police. It was in this environment that Popkov grew up, eventually blending into the fabric of the community so seamlessly that no one could have imagined the devastation he would later cause. As an adult, he pursued a career in law enforcement, becoming a police officer in the Irkutsk region. The uniform gave him authority, structure, and a social respect. Alongside his police work, he spent time employed as a security guard at the Angarsk Oil and Chemical Company and later at a private firm. To those around him, he appeared stable and dependable. He was married to his wife Elena and had a daughter named Ekaterina. He attended family gatherings, maintained employment, and presented himself as a responsible father and husband. The contrast between this domestic image and the violence he carried out at night would later shock the nation. The murders began in 1992, during a turbulent period in Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Social instability, rising crime rates, and weakened institutions created an environment where patterns of violence could remain undetected for years. Women in Angarsk began disappearing. Some were found dead in forests or near remote roads, their bodies discovered by chance hikers or construction workers. Others were missing for long stretches of time before remains were uncovered. Between 1992 and 2011, Popkov murdered dozens of women between the ages of 19 and 50, along with one male police officer. His victims were not all sex workers, despite his later claims. Many were ordinary women who had been walking home from parties, visiting friends, or simply out at night. Popkov claimed he wanted to cleanse the streets of prostitutes and insisted he was guided by his inner convictions. These statements revealed not morality, but delusion and self-justification. He constructed a narrative in which he was carrying out a mission, positioning himself as someone restoring order rather than destroying lives. He also accused his wife of infidelity without evidence, blaming imagined betrayal for fueling his rage. Psychiatrists later suggested that a troubled childhood, possibly involving an alcoholic and abusive mother, may have shaped his personality, but psychological speculation cannot excuse calculated brutality sustained over nearly 20 years. Popkov's method relied heavily on manipulation and authority. Wearing his police uniform or identifying himself as an officer, he would patrol the streets at night, searching for women alone. In a city where winters were unforgiving and public transport unreliable, a ride from a uniformed officer felt safe. That trust was the key to his crimes. He would offer assistance, sometimes engaging in small talk to lower defenses, presenting himself as courteous and helpful. Instead of driving the women home, he steered toward isolated areas, forest clearings, cemeteries, abandoned roads on the outskirts of Angarsk. Once there, the atmosphere shifted from reassurance to terror. He forced his victims to undress and attack them with extreme violence, using knives, axes, screwdrivers, baseball bats, and whatever other tools he carried. The attacks were not impulsive. They were sustained and deliberate. Many victims were sexually assaulted. Some were mutilated so severely that identification became a long and painful process for families. The brutality was so shocking that Russian media eventually labeled him the werewolf and the Angarsk maniac, names reflecting both his savagery and the double life he maintained. By day, he enforced the law. By night, he violated every principle it stood for. Throughout the mid-1990s and early 2000s, investigators searched for a single perpetrator as more bodies were discovered bearing similar patterns of violence. Despite extensive inquiries and testimonies from surviving victims, the killer remained unidentified. Popkov's position within law enforcement shielded him from suspicion. The idea that a serving or former officer could be responsible was difficult for many to accept. However, investigators eventually noticed a recurring detail at several crime scenes. Tire tracks from a Lada 4 vehicle commonly used by law enforcement in the region. This observation shifted the focus inward. In 2012, authorities undertook a massive DNA testing operation involving approximately 3,500 current and former police officers in Irkutsk. The scale of the screening reflected both desperation and determination. The results identified Popkov as a match to biological evidence collected from multiple victims. He was arrested in 2012, ending a killing spree that had lasted nearly 2 decades. In January 2015, Popkov was sentenced to life imprisonment for 22 murders and 2 attempted murders. For many families, the sentence offered formal recognition of their suffering, but could not erase years of uncertainty and grief. The story, however, did not end with that verdict. 2 years later, Popkov confessed to 59 additional killings, dramatically increasing the scale of the tragedy. On December 10, 2018, after another trial in the Irkutsk Regional Court, he was convicted of 56 further murders and received a second life sentence. 3 alleged killings could not be confirmed due to insufficient evidence, but the total number of confirmed victims already placed him among the most prolific serial killers in Russian history. His confessions continued even while incarcerated. In July 2020, he admitted to 2 more murders, bringing his acknowledged victim count to 83. On June 4, 2021, he was found guilty of 2 additional killings and sentenced to an extra 9 years and 8 months. In November 2023, he was convicted of 3 more murders and given another 10-year sentence added to his existing terms. Behind these numbers are human stories. Families who waited for daughters who never returned, parents who searched forests and riverbanks for answers, children who grew up without mothers. Popkov exploited not only physical vulnerability, but institutional trust. His uniform symbolized protection, yet he used it as camouflage. The betrayal extended beyond individual victims. It shook public confidence in the systems meant to safeguard communities. Today, he remains imprisoned, serving multiple life sentences plus additional years. Angarsk, once an unremarkable Siberian city, carries the memory of the women whose lives were stolen. His case stands as a reminder of how easily authority can be abused and how long darkness can hide behind a respectable face before it is finally exposed. Case 3 Vasily Filippenko was born in the coastal city of Kerch, a place where the endless gray waves of the sea met the skies and muted horizons, and life moved with a rhythm as constant and unyielding as the tides themselves. For the first 30 years of his life, he lived quietly in this port town, working as a crane operator, a job demanding physical strength, precision, and nerves of steel, which he possessed in abundance. On a fateful day, however, his ordinary life was violently disrupted when he fell from a great height while performing his duties atop the towering port cranes. The fall shattered his body in 17 different places, leaving him at the edge of death and dragging him into weeks of excruciating pain and surgeries. As he lay in a hospital, frail and broken, the woman who had once shared his life, believing that he would never recover, filed for divorce, leaving him not just physically injured but emotionally scarred. Though Filippenko regained his physical health against all odds, the emotional wound festered, turning into a deep resentment and hostility toward women. What had once been an ordinary life became a simmering brew of anger, betrayal, and obsession, the kind that begins quietly but grows into something uncontrollable. In 1966, seeking both anonymity and opportunity, Filippenko moved to Leningrad, a sprawling city of canals, bridges, and shadowed alleyways, where he resumed work as a crane operator at the port and took residence in a dormitory under a propiska. On the surface, he appeared to integrate seamlessly into society, diligent at work, polite with colleagues, and even volunteering with the Voluntary People's Druzina, a civic patrol organization, masking the storm that raged within him. By 1967, that storm erupted. The Obvodny Canal area, with its dimly lit embankments and deserted streets in the evenings, became the stage for his predatory obsessions. He did not strike randomly. His victims were women he had seen parting with men, a pattern born of his own trauma and twisted resentment toward women. His first victim, 19-year-old factory worker Nina Pedikova, crossed paths with him on the night of May 23rd to 24th, 1967, near the canal embankment after parting with a sailor who had accompanied her. Filippenko lured her to a round-the-clock kindergarten and the women's hostel of her factory, where, triggered by the reminder of his ex-wife, he attacked her with a violence born of years of accumulated pain. He beat her, raped her, and strangled her, leaving her lifeless body in a place where the distant screams went unheeded by on-duty staff. Forensic evidence would later provide traces of him in her hair and sperm, but the initial investigation faltered when a merchant seaman, Sergei Sergeyev, was mistakenly suspected. Even when Sergeyev reported seeing a man in a hat and raincoat on the canal bridge, the police failed to act decisively. Encouraged by the missteps of authorities, Filippenko's confidence grew, and by July of the same year, he committed a second attack, beating and raping another woman near her home, but sparing her life, a momentary restraint that demonstrated both his calculated cruelty and meticulous planning. The survivor, when shown photographs, mistakenly identified another man, Igor Vorobiev, who was wrongfully arrested and sentenced to 6 years for rape while innocent of murder, highlighting the errors and pressure faced by law enforcement in identifying the true perpetrator. As summer turned to autumn, Filippenko escalated his attacks, preying on women in Bakin Hospital, where he lured 25-year-old nurse Tatyana Kuznetsova in the courtyard after she had sought refuge from another pursuer. He raped and strangled her, taking money from her handbag, a deviation from previous crimes that demonstrated both opportunism and increasing boldness. On October 18th, during a flood that left the streets of Leningrad deserted, he attacked Galina Ivanova on the embankment of the Obvodny Canal, dragging her to a construction site and strangling her with her own tights. The city was on edge, with police increasing patrols and attempting to use live bait, but Filippenko's cunning ensured he remained beyond their grasp. Later that same month, he attacked LDI student Fina Anshak near her home, fatally breaking her hyoid bone during an attempted strangulation, causing her trachea to swell and ending her life in a suffocating silence. Authorities faced mounting pressure from the city's political leadership, but their investigation continued to misfire. In early November, a young man named Viktor Danilov, a member of the so-called Golden Youth with no occupation and intellectual disability, was arrested and pressured into confessing to crimes he had not committed, including attacks in the Obvodny Canal area. His apartment was ransacked, and forensic coincidences such as a matching blood type led authorities to falsely believe the maniac had been captured. Meanwhile, Filippenko struck again, murdering fish shop saleswoman Valentina Stenikova and disposing of her body in the canal. For fear of scandal, authorities falsified examination results, hiding the sexual assault and declaring her death a suicide due to intoxication. Families of victims protested, but bureaucratic obfuscation ensured the truth remained buried until fate intervened. At the start of 1968, Filippenko traveled to Yalta using a trade union voucher, where he attempted to rape and strangle a sanatorium maid. Arrested and detained in Simferopol, he confessed in detail to his cellmate, unaware the man was a police informant. His confessions, relayed to Leningrad investigators, allowed authorities to connect him to the 5 murders in the Obvodny Canal area with chilling accuracy. Filippenko, who had once helped the police in his guise as a Drazinik, had been hunting himself while continuing his spree. Innocent individuals like Danilov and Vorobiev were exonerated, and officials responsible for investigative failures were dismissed. Attempts by Filippenko to feign insanity failed. Forensic psychiatric examinations confirmed he was sane, fully aware of his acts. In 1968, the court sentenced Vasily Filippenko to death by firing squad, a sentence carried out in November, bringing a grim and delayed justice to the victims he had terrorized. His story remains a haunting testament to the thin line between ordinary life and monstrous impulses, the consequences of trauma unaddressed, and the failures of a system ill-prepared for such a cunning predator. Case 4 Dmitry Grydin was born in 1968 in the industrial city of Magnitogorsk, a city dominated by the relentless smoke and heat of its massive iron and steel works, where the air always seemed to hum with the ceaseless rhythm of machinery. Born into a respected family, Grydin's early life was steeped in a blend of privilege and expectation. His father was the head of a workshop at the city's steelworks, a position that demanded strict discipline, technical skill, and a relentless work ethic. Growing up in such an environment, Dmitry was exposed to the disciplined routines of industrial life, the pride of familial achievement, and the subtle pressures of a household where reputation and success mattered deeply. He attended the local schools, and, as a student at Magnitogorsk State Technical University, he showed an aptitude for technical subjects, fitting neatly into the mold his family envisioned for him. He married and had a daughter, an infant only 6 months old, anchoring him, at least superficially, in a life of domestic normalcy and societal respectability, but beneath the veneer of ordinary family life, an unsettling darkness began to stir. The first signs were subtle, manifesting in thoughts and behaviors that were out of alignment with the peaceful, industrious world he outwardly inhabited. By the late 1980s, Grydin's internal compulsions had escalated into action. On the night of July 31st, 1989, he committed his first murder, taking the life of 16-year-old Jenna Taranchuk on the porch of her home. The act itself was both shocking and methodical. He had stalked, waited, and then attacked with a precision that spoke of preparation. This initial murder marked the beginning of a series of assaults that would terrify Magnitogorsk. Over the next month, he attempted 3 more attacks on girls, each unsuccessful but increasingly daring, as if each failure only fueled the compulsion within him. In one of these attacks, a girl survived and provided authorities with a detailed description of the assailant, whom she referred to as the lifter, hinting at his familiarity with the urban terrain and the ominous air of menace that surrounded his presence. Grydin's methodical violence escalated with the murders of Danzili Usmanova and Ludmila Pozniakova, a series of killings that left the city on edge. At one crime scene, he left behind a fingerprint, a silent trace of his identity that would later become pivotal in his apprehension. On November 25, 1989, an attempted attack turned disastrous for him. The intended victim resisted fiercely, forcing him to flee and inadvertently leave behind personal items, his hat and glasses. It was this unplanned exposure, combined with the severe winter conditions of Magnitogorsk, with a mercury plummeted to minus 20 degrees Celsius, that made him stand out in the streets and ultimately contributed to his capture. Authorities also confiscated a knife from him at the time of his arrest, cementing the case against him. The Grydin case quickly resonated through the community, igniting a profound sense of fear and outrage. The citizens of Magnitogorsk, already shaken by the brutal loss of young lives, demanded justice in the most immediate and visceral form, calling for public execution. The atmosphere in the city was tense, with rumors, whispered warnings, and the palpable anxiety of parents fearful for the safety of their children. The trial, which commenced in the fall of 1990, was accompanied by public unrest. Crowds filled the courts and streets, their anger directed not just at Gryden, but at a justice system that had, in their eyes, been slow to prevent such horrors. On October 3, 1990, the Chelyabinsk Regional Court sentenced Dmitry Gryden to death, a verdict that seemed to satisfy the public's demand for immediate and irreversible justice. Yet, political and legal shifts in the early 1990s led to a commutation of his sentence to life imprisonment in December 1993, a decision that stirred both legal debate and public frustration. He was transferred to Ogneny Ostrov in the Vologda Oblast, an island fortress prison known for its isolation and harsh conditions. There, the steel-clad walls and freezing winters became his new environment, a stark contrast to the bustling urban landscape in which he had committed his crimes. During his long years of imprisonment, Gryden remained unrepentant, refusing to admit guilt even as he navigated the complex bureaucracies of the Russian penal system. In 2000, he filed an appeal with the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which acknowledged violations in the handling of his case. Despite this recognition, the Russian leadership refused to release him, citing the cessation of attacks on women after his arrest as evidence of the continued threat he posed. In 2013, a crew from the TV program Investigation Conducted visited Gryden in his Vologda colony, providing a rare window into his daily existence behind bars. In this interview, he expressed intentions to apply for parole in 2014, marking 25 years since his initial arrest. Yet the wheels of justice and bureaucracy moved slowly and unyieldingly against him. His subsequent attempts to challenge presidential pardons and to file for parole were repeatedly denied, with courts upholding prior decisions. In 2014, the Belozersky District Court rejected his parole request. In 2017, the Volga Regional Court dismissed his appeal. Through decades of incarceration, he never acknowledged his culpability, maintaining a stoic, unyielding facade against both the legal system and societal condemnation. The story of Dmitry Gryden is one of stark contrasts. The outward appearance of normalcy and societal integration, juxtaposed with an inner darkness that manifested in calculated violence and terror. It is a narrative that spans the corridors of a technical university, the industrial streets of Magnitogorsk, and the cold isolation of a prison island, reflecting not just the acts of a serial killer, but the broader societal, legal, and psychological dimensions of crime, punishment, and human obsession. Gryden's life and crimes remain a chilling testament to the capacity for hidden malice, the meticulousness of predatory behavior, and the long shadows cast by acts of extreme violence. Case 5 Vasily Turinovich Petrov was born in 1871 into a sprawling, impoverished family in the Vitebsk governorate of the Russian Empire, a household where hardship was the norm and alcohol had woven itself into the fabric of daily life. The men in his family, struggling under the weight of poverty and despair, often turned to drink, and Petrov himself began consuming alcohol at the tender age of 15, a habit that would shadow him throughout his life. As a young man, he was conscripted into the Russian army, spending 4 years in service, where the rigid discipline of military life contrasted sharply with the chaotic domestic environment of his upbringing, yet did little to curb the demons that had begun to take root within him. At the age of 28, Petrov married, seeking perhaps stability or companionship, though his path soon veered into turmoil. In 1904, amid the tumult of the Russian-Japanese War, he journeyed to the Far East, a land both distant and full of opportunity, where he managed to amass a modest fortune through his endeavors, only to squander it in reckless pursuits, reflecting both his impulsiveness and the inescapable grip of his vices. His actions eventually caught up with him when he committed a robbery at a military warehouse, leading to a 1-year prison sentence, during which misfortune compounded as his wife succumbed to cholera, leaving him bereft and setting the stage for the darker chapters of his life. Upon his release, Petrov sought a fresh start in Riga, then part of the Russian Empire and now within Latvia, where he married a Polish widow named Sofia, with whom he had 2 children, though the shadows of his past lingered. Despite the semblance of family life, his alcoholism persisted, and his frustrations and rage often manifested violently, resulting in repeated beatings of both his wife and children, creating a household marked by fear and suffering, and illustrating a tragic pattern of inherited dysfunction and personal failure that would define his existence. In 1915, as the German Empire's troops pressed into the Baltic, Vasily Petrov, already weathered by life's hardships, gathered his family and fled to the Volga region, trying to shield them from the looming horrors of war, though safety remained fragile and uncertain. The chaos of the collapsing Russian Empire in 1917 drew him into the Red Army, a world of uniforms, discipline, and bloodshed that strangely offered both purpose and education. He learned to read and write, skills that had always slipped through his fingers, and earned the rank of platoon commander, commanding men while carrying the weight of his own tumultuous past. Yet even this new life was not without peril. During the Russian Civil War, he was captured by General Denikin's White Army, facing imprisonment and possible death, until he managed a tense, desperate escape. Haunted by the fear of the Military Revolutionary Tribunal, he reinvented himself, shedding his old identity and taking the name Vasily Ivanovich Komarov, amassed to move through the uncertain streets of a city and country transformed by revolution. By 1920, he had settled his family in Moscow at 26 Shabalovka Street, living a double life. By day, a carriage driver and horse trader, skilled and familiar in the rhythm of horses and city streets, and by shadowed impulse, still drawn to theft, a compulsion he could neither fully conceal nor suppress. In this uneasy balance between family, survival, and the darker instincts that had always lingered beneath the surface, Komarov navigated a world reshaped by war, revolution, and personal loss, a man both ordinary and quietly menacing, trying to reconcile the life he led with the man he had become. In February of 1921, as the new economic policy unfolded under Vladimir Lenin, opening the doors to private enterprise, Vasily Komarov quietly began to unleash the darkness that had long been simmering within him, committing his first calculated murders under the guise of horse trading. The pattern was meticulous, chilling in its regularity. He would meet a client eager to purchase a horse, invite them into his modest Moscow home, offer vodka to loosen their defenses, and then strike with a hammer or, at times, slit their throat. The lifeless bodies were placed into sacks, hidden around the house, buried discreetly, or unceremoniously dumped into the murky waters of the Moscow River. Even more disturbingly, his wife Sophia, upon discovering the crimes, did not react with horror or denial, but instead integrated herself into the killings, assisting Komarov in ways that rendered the couple a lethal team, their home a grim staging ground for death. In 1921 alone, Komarov claimed at least 17 victims, and over the subsequent 2 years, at least 12 more, though he would later confess to 33 murders, painting a portrait of a methodical and remorseless predator. Authorities began to take notice when the bodies of 21 men were discovered, disposed of in sacks of refuse, regularly appearing on Thursdays and Saturdays, sparking a lengthy, painstaking investigation that spanned 2 years. Despite this, Komarov maintained the appearance of a respectable family man, well regarded in public, yet behind closed doors, he was violently abusive and even attempted to endanger his 8-year-old son, a fact known only to the few who glimpsed the darkness of his private life. In the marketplace where he sold his horses, observant onlookers noticed his unusual routine. He arrived every Wednesday and Friday, sometimes with no horse at all, and invariably left with a client, a subtle pattern of movement that, in hindsight, foreshadowed the sinister trail he was leaving across Moscow, unnoticed by the casual eye, but steadily weaving a thread of fear and suspicion through the city streets. In the early months of 1923, the police, initially investigating allegations of illegal alcohol production, arrived at Komarov's home, only to stumble upon a far darker truth. Hidden beneath a heap of hay in the family stable lay the body of his latest victim, a grim discovery that immediately cast suspicion over the seemingly ordinary carriage driver. Komarov, ever quick and desperate, initially evaded capture by leaping from a window, slipping through the authorities' grasp, but by March 18th, 1923, he was finally apprehended in Moscow Oblast, brought under control as the net of law enforcement closed around him. During intensive interrogations, the full scale of his crimes emerged, as Komarov admitted to taking the lives of 33 men, clients lured under the pretense of purchasing horses, each killing carried out with chilling casualness. Though robbery appeared to be a driving motive, the total material gain from all his murders was surprisingly meager, reflecting that his acts were fueled more by compulsion and dark desire than by financial need. In a macabre act of cooperation, he guided police to the locations where he had disposed of his victims' bodies, though despite his directions, only 6 of the remaining 12 could be recovered, leaving a haunting gap that spoke to the ineffable horror of his actions. Komarov, when reflecting on his killings, chillingly remarked that taking a life had been an awfully easy job, a statement that revealed the cold detachment and moral void within him. While imprisoned, he made multiple attempts to end his own life, trying 3 separate times to escape his conscience through death. His wife, Sophia, was implicated alongside him. As investigators concluded, it would have been impossible for her not to have been aware of the murders happening in the adjacent stable, and she was held culpable for at least some of the crimes. Psychiatric evaluation pronounced Komarov sane, though it acknowledged his status as an alcoholic, degenerate, and psychopath, capable of planning and executing heinous acts while maintaining a veneer of normality. Both Vasily Komarov and Sophia faced the full weight of the law. They were sentenced to death, and on June 18, 1923, in a chilling culmination of justice, husband and wife were executed by firing squad in Moscow, bringing an end to a series of killings that had terrorized the city and left an indelible mark on its history. Case 6 Korneev's early life is shrouded in mystery. No one knows the exact date or place of his birth. By 1968, he was already 38, a man whose life had been defined by extraordinary physical strength and daring feats. He had once thrilled audiences as a circus performer, juggling heavy weights with precision and flair, drawing applause that seemed endless. But the stage that had once celebrated him soon betrayed him. During a performance, he tore a tendon, a cruel injury that abruptly ended his career in the circus. Yet, even as his body failed him, Korneev's desire for attention, admiration, and recognition did not fade. He yearned for the spotlight, searching for new ways to capture it. In Moscow, he turned to a different kind of stage, the printed page. He began placing personal advertisements in the newspaper, seeking companionship and connection, and perhaps a way to reclaim some of the fame he had lost. These ads quickly drew attention. 3 women responded, each with her own story and her own vulnerabilities. Among them was Irina Skelkanova, Yulia Trofimova, and the youngest of them all, Natalia Delyagina, who had just turned 18. Natalia's life had been marked by profound suffering. She had grown up living with her stepmother, Galina, after losing her father at the age of 13. In the years that followed, her stepmother exerted a cruel and controlling influence over her life. Under the guise of household help, Galina forced Natalia into unspeakable acts, compelling her to submit to men who came to assist with chores, all while feeding her alcohol to dull her resistance. Natalia endured these horrors silently, consumed by shame, trapped under Galina's total control. The abuse left deep scars, shaping her understanding of trust, affection, and fear. Yet, when she saw Korneev's advertisement, something stirred within her, a glimmer of possibility, a chance for a different life. Yulia Trofimova's story, by contrast, was one of cautious independence. Divorced and raising her young daughter, Oksana, she found in Korneev a figure of protection and stability. Their relationship offered her a sense of safety and belonging that she had not known before, and she cherished him for the security he seemed to provide. And so, these women entered Korneev's life, each drawn by their own hopes and needs, each unaware of how profoundly their paths would intertwine with his. It was a collision of pasts, pains, and desires, a convergence that would set the stage for events that neither the audience nor the participants could fully predict. In 1968, Kornev was living in Voskresensk, Moscow Oblast, sharing his home with 3 women, but life was slowly slipping into frustration as he struggled to find steady work and felt the weight of disappointment pressing down on him. Tensions rose when Irina Skelkanova, one of the women, became pregnant by a roommate and began relentlessly demanding that Kornev marry her. His patience snapped one day during yet another argument, and in a sudden, violent act, he strangled her with a wire while she was in the 20th week of pregnancy. Afterward, he dragged her lifeless body onto the roof of a nearby industrial building and let it fall onto a parked bus below. At the time, the bus driver was away having lunch and had no idea of the horrifying scene above him. When the bus reached the next stop, Skelkanova's body hit the asphalt, and the driver, rushing to help, realized with horror that she was already dead, the marks on her neck revealing the cruel force of strangulation. Investigators traced the dragging marks near the industrial building and pieced together the scene. While identifying the victim took nearly a week, leaving the city in shock over the brutality and sheer audacity of the crime. Skelkanova's mother revealed that her daughter often scanned newspapers for personal ads, and investigators quickly found several of these hidden around her home. One ad led them to Sergei Paganovsky, an employee of the USSR Ministry of Culture, who had listed himself under the name Svyatoslav. When criminal investigator Alexei Morozov went to question him, Paganovsky's dog suddenly lunged at the officer, forcing Morozov to shoot the animal before detaining the man. Under questioning, it emerged that Paganovsky had been secretly placing dating ads without his wife's knowledge, meeting women who responded, engaging in sexual relationships, and then discarding them. On top of this, he had no solid alibi for the time of Skelkanova's murder, making him a person of significant interest in the investigation. Shortly after Paganovsky's arrest, Boris Kornev struck again. When Natalia Delyagina confided that her stepmother, Galina, had abused her for years, Kornev brutally strangled Galina and tied her lifeless body to a construction vehicle. Investigators noted the chilling similarity to Irina Skelkanova's murder. The same rough strangulation marks and an alarming amount of alcohol in Galina's bloodstream, evidence that she had been forced to drink. Authorities quickly suspected that Delyagina's lover might be involved, but she refused to reveal his identity, even hinting he might have committed other murders, viewing him as a twisted kind of hero for avenging her suffering. To catch the killer, Sergeant Yuri Markelov was stationed at Delyagina's house, but Kornev struck again, entering the home and, despite the sergeant's boxing skills, strangling him on the spot. Not stopping there, Kornev kidnapped Delyagina herself. Her disappearance triggered an all-union search, and it wasn't long before a couple stumbled upon her body on a remote phosphogypsum mountain, adding another horrifying chapter to the trail of terror he left behind. Kornev explained his long absences to Yulia Trofimova by claiming he had traveled to a neighboring region in search of work, but behind closed doors, his cruelty escalated. He began tormenting her young daughter, Oksana, chaining her to a heavy iron weight and forcing her to perform grueling push-ups. When Oksana's father, Petr, came to check on her, he quickly realized the horror she had endured, but Kornev silenced him forever, strangling him and hiding his body in a ravine. Terrified, Oksana confided in her mother, revealing her suspicions that Kornev had killed her father. Yet the terror did not end there. Kornev returned one night to the house, covered in phosphorus so he glowed in the dark, attempting to frighten both Trofimova and Oksana. Reacting quickly, Trofimova sent Oksana to her grandmother's care and alerted the authorities, but Kornev's rage only intensified. He beat and tied up Trofimova, then, in a twisted display of menace, called Oksana at her grandmother's house, whispering a chilling threat. If she didn't come to the old garages that night, he would kill her mother, reminding her ominously of the change she would need to bring. Terrified of losing her mother if she involved the police, Oksana turned to her friend and classmate, Nikolai, for help instead. Together, they went to the location Kornev had designated, armed with a hammer and a knife. Kornev came prepared with his wire, but Oksana bravely struck him in the chest with the knife. Though he remained standing, Nikolai delivered a powerful blow to Korneev's head with a hammer. Korneev fought back, hitting Nikolai and sending him stumbling toward a nearby tree, but eventually, Korneev collapsed to the ground, gravely injured and bleeding heavily. He survived and was taken to the hospital, where he was declared legally insane and confined to a secure psychiatric facility. Weeks later, his life ended violently when his roommates strangled him. Nikolai, meanwhile, required multiple surgeries and initially had to rely on a wheelchair, but with Oksana's relentless support and encouragement, he gradually regained strength and learned to walk again. In time, the two married and built a family together, finding a measure of peace and happiness after the horrors they had endured. K7 Serebryakov entered the world on August 18, 1941, in Malgobek, a small town in the Chechen-Ingush SSR, during a time of upheaval and uncertainty. From an early age, it became clear that he was different from other children. He had a volatile temper and a growing dependence on alcohol that only intensified as he grew older. His childhood was marked by constant conflict. He would pick fights with strangers in the street, clash with relatives over trivial matters, and quarrel endlessly with anyone who crossed his path. These patterns of violence followed him into adulthood, and over time, Serebryakov became known to the local police. Authorities suspected him in a range of offenses from theft and assault to arson and even sexual assault. But for reasons that remain unclear, they were never able to secure a conviction, leaving his criminal tendencies unchecked. In January 1967, a turning point arrived when he was demobilized from the Soviet army. Perhaps hoping for a fresh start, Serebryakov moved to Kybyshev to live with his sister, seeking the stability and support of family life. There, he found work at the Kybyshev cable plant, a position that could have provided him with structure and a routine. But despite the outward appearance of normalcy, the violent impulses that had plagued him since childhood lingered beneath the surface. He was a man caught between the possibility of ordinary life and the darker urges that seemed to follow him like a shadow, a tension that would shape the events to come in ways few could have anticipated. On September 4th, 1967, Serebryakov's violent tendencies escalated into a terrifying act. He burst into the control room of one of Kybyshev's tram depots, clad only in swimming trunks and brandishing a knife. His target was Yekaterina Karadanova, a dispatcher working that night. The attack was sudden and brutal. He slashed at her with a knife, wounding her in the neck and arm. But Yekaterina fought back fiercely, and Serebryakov, startled by her resistance, panicked and fled the scene before completing his assault. It would be nearly 2 years before his first murders occurred, on the night of April 27th to 28th, 1969, marking a horrifying turning point in his criminal trajectory. Serebryakov slipped into a one-story dormitory on Elektro-Fitzrovania Street, today known as Litvinov Street, through an open window of one of the living rooms. Inside, the scene of terror unfolded with shocking brutality. He struck Stepan Zorkin, his young 5-year-old son Lyonya, and his wife Maria with a brick, killing them all instantly. The violence did not stop with their deaths. Serebryakov then committed the unthinkable, raping Maria's corpse. He stole 135 rubles before setting her clothing ablaze, causing a fire that damaged several of the dormitory's rooms. In the immediate aftermath, suspicion initially fell on Maria's ex-husband, as the true horror of the crime had yet to be discovered. The brutality of Serebryakov's actions left a scar not just on the victim's family, but on the entire community, marking the beginning of a reign of terror that would soon escalate further. A year after his first killings, Serebryakov struck again, his violence escalating with chilling precision. On the night of April 30th, 1970, he broke into an apartment on Aeroflot Street, carrying an axe with a blunt side intended for brutal use. Inside, he attacked the landlady, Ekaterina Kutsivalova, and her daughter Olga, striking them repeatedly. Convinced Ekaterina was dead, he attempted to rape her, only for Olga to regain consciousness and scream, alerting the neighbors. The commotion terrified Serebryakov, forcing him to flee before he could complete his horrific act, leaving both women alive but traumatized. Even in his temporary retreat, he continued hunting for victims, riding his bicycle through the city streets, scanning for opportunities to strike. Just over a week later, on the night of May 8th to 9th, 1970, Serebryakov claimed two more victims, 70-year-old Praskovia Silova and 30-year-old Nina Vasilieva, both killed with the same ruthless efficiency using an axe. In the confusion that followed, a man named Timofeev falsely confessed to these murders, but the investigation soon revealed his claim to be a lie. The city of Kybyshev was gripped by fear as residents realized that a cunning and brutal predator was roaming freely, selecting victims at will and leaving a trail of terror in his wake. By 1970, panic had gripped the city of Kybyshev. Rumors of the ruthless killer spread through neighborhoods like wildfire, leaving residents terrified to step outside or even answer the door. The fear was so pervasive that it even disrupted the upcoming Supreme Soviet elections. Agitators sent to collect votes were repeatedly turned away, even when accompanied by police officers, as terrified citizens declared firmly, "Until the killer is caught, we will not vote." Amid this climate of terror, Serebryakov struck again on the night of June 4th to 5th, 1970. He entered a house on Podgornaya Street in the Oktyabrski district, near the quiet country park, and carried out one of his most horrific attacks yet. Armed with an axe, he hacked the Malomanov family, father, mother, and their two children, to death, leaving a scene of unimaginable horror. He then violated the mother's corpse before setting the house ablaze, engulfing the home in flames. Without hesitation, Serebryakov fled the scene on his bicycle, leaving behind a trail of destruction and fear that would plunge the entire district into shock. The city had now been forced to confront the chilling reality. A calculated, remorseless predator was on the loose, and no one was safe. On May 22nd, 1970, authorities took decisive action to end the reign of terror in Kybyshev. An investigative brigade was formed under the leadership of General Igor Karpets, tasked with hunting down the elusive and dangerous killer. Police patrols on the city streets were significantly reinforced, while volunteers from the community eagerly joined the effort, determined to protect their neighborhoods and bring the murderer to justice. During the investigation, a crucial piece of evidence was discovered near one of the crime scenes: a bicycle key stamped with the logo of the Kharkov bicycle factory. This discovery shifted the focus of the search, prompting investigators to pay special attention to cyclists who might fit the profile of the perpetrator. The city held its collective breath, aware that the next breakthrough could finally lead them to the man who had terrorized their streets for so long. On June 8th, 1970, Serebryakov's reign of terror finally came to an end, but not without a dramatic confrontation. He was riding his bicycle along a quiet side street near the airport highway when Druzinik Zagfar Gayfulin spotted him. At first, Serebryakov seemed like any ordinary cyclist, blending into the evening shadows. But a sudden gust of wind blew open his cloak, revealing the unmistakable shape of an axe strapped to his back. Instantly, suspicion turned into pursuit. Serebryakov bolted, leaping into the courtyard of a private house and taking cover inside a street toilet. The Druzhniki, accompanied by the awakened homeowner, combed the yard in search of him. When Viktor Kakanov opened the toilet door, he was struck in the face and then hit on the head with a brick, barely avoiding serious injury. Serebryakov fled again, sprinting toward the nearby Internetnaya railway station, where freight trains with fuel oil tanks were stationed. He climbed onto one of the tanks, hoping the train would carry him to freedom, but an alert machinist assistant spotted him. Cornered, he ran across the tracks toward the asphalt plant, scaled a tree, and then leapt into the grounds of the Progress Rocket Space Center, setting off alarms in the process. It was there that the plant security finally detained him and handed him over to the police. His arrest occurred just a week before the upcoming elections, bringing relief to a city long held in fear. The officer who captured Serebryakov was recognized for his bravery, receiving a promotion from senior lieutenant to major, a reward that reflected the danger and intensity of the chase. After his dramatic arrest, forensic evidence quickly sealed Serebryakov's fate. His fingerprints and blood type were matched to the scenes of the murders, and investigators discovered stolen items from his victims hidden in his room. Confronted with the mounting evidence, he soon confessed to the string of brutal crimes that had terrorized Kaibyshev for years. A thorough forensic psychiatric examination followed, revealing that while Serebryakov displayed clear behavioral abnormalities and dangerous tendencies, he did not suffer from a mental illness that would prevent prosecution. Experts concluded that his actions were deliberate and calculated, and he was diagnosed as a psychopath, a man fully aware of his deeds, yet entirely devoid of remorse. The findings brought a chilling clarity. Kaibyshev's most notorious killer was not insane, but a predator who had methodically hunted his victims and now faced the full weight of justice. When Serebryakov finally stood trial, the courtroom was overflowing with spectators, while dozens more pressed against the windows, desperate to catch a glimpse of the man who had brought fear to Kaibyshev for nearly a year and a half. Every eye was on him as the proceedings unfolded, the tension in the air nearly palpable. In the fall of 1970, the Kaibyshev Regional Court handed down its verdict: death. The moment the sentence was read, a wave of relief swept through the audience, some even applauding the decision. Serebryakov, however, met the judgment with chilling composure, muttering ominously, "I'll be back." Despite any attempts to appeal, all his petitions for clemency were rejected. In early 1971, Boris Serebryakov was executed in Syzran prison, bringing a final, grim end to his violent spree. In recognition of their bravery and dedication, all the militiamen who had played a crucial role in tracking down and capturing the notoriously dangerous criminal were awarded medals for excellent service in the protection of public order, a testament to their courage in the face of unimaginable danger. Kaibyshev could finally begin to breathe again, knowing that the man who had haunted its streets was no more. Case 8. Alexei Vasilyevich Sukhlatin was born in 1943 in Kazan, RSFSR, in the heart of the Soviet Union. His early life was marked by uncertainty and absence, while his mother worked tirelessly as a nurse in a military field hospital, her presence a rare constant in his life. There is no recorded information about his father. Growing up in this fragmented household, Sukhlatin developed a troubling relationship with alcohol, drinking heavily throughout his adolescence and into adulthood, a habit that would increasingly feed his violent impulses and cloud his judgment. Sukhlatin's descent into criminality began at the young age of 16. In February 1960, under the cover of night, he attacked a young girl, striking her over the head with a heavy object and attempting to rape her. Fortunately, two young men intervened, rescuing the girl and confronting Sukhlatin, who was forced to leave the scene. However, his actions could not go unpunished, and he was soon arrested. The court sentenced him to 2 years in a youth detention center, a punishment meant to correct rather than permanently imprison, though it clearly failed to curb his dangerous behavior. Upon reaching adulthood, Sukhlatin was transferred to a corrective labor colony, where the rigidity of the system and harsh conditions only hardened him further. It was within these walls that the patterns of violence, aggression, and disregard for authority, already visible in his teenage years, were reinforced. The young man who had once terrorized a girl on a dark February night was now being shaped into someone far more dangerous, laying the foundation for the brutal crimes that would later bring fear and horror to those around him. By 1964, Alexei Sukhlatin's criminal behavior had become more organized and brazen. That year, he committed a new crime alongside a group of accomplices, men with whom he regularly drank and spent his days wandering in search of opportunity. Once inside, the men struck the woman on the head with a heavy object and took 80 rubles, leaving her injured but alive. The victim reported the attack to the authorities, setting in motion a rapid response. Within hours, Sukhlatin and his accomplices were apprehended at the nearest bar, their night of violence abruptly ended by the police. For this crime, Sukhlatin was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a punishment meant to contain the danger he represented. However, even behind bars, he displayed a calculating and manipulative intelligence. He began cooperating with law enforcement, meticulously recounting his prior convictions and providing insight into his criminal behavior. During his time in the colony, he immersed himself in reading, devouring books, and accumulating knowledge that would later become a tool of seduction. This erudition gave him a veneer of charm, which he would later exploit to manipulate and lure women, turning intellect into a weapon as lethal as his physical violence. In 1976, Alexei Sukletin was released from prison, stepping back into society with a checkered past and a restless energy that quickly found trouble. Initially, he found work at an insurance company, but he never truly committed to the position, skipping shifts and avoiding responsibilities. Soon after, he took a job as a guard for a horticultural association, yet his habitual absences led to his dismissal. His sporadic work history continued, and by 1978, he was employed as a medical orderly in a psychiatric hospital, a position that put him in close proximity to vulnerable individuals. A year later, he returned to guarding duties, this time at the garden community Kinlik in the urban settlement of Vasilyevo, a job that offered him minimal oversight and ample freedom. That same year, Sukletin encountered 23-year-old Medina Nerdzovnovna Shakarova, a local of Vasilyevo, and the two began living together. He fabricated stories about his past, claiming that he had been serving time in a Kazakh penal camp but had escaped, a lie meant to impress and manipulate her. Shakarova herself had a complicated history. Before meeting Sukletin, she had worked in Uzbekistan and later moved to Kazan, holding jobs as a turner at a factory and later as a breeder on a farm. She had also had a child, whom she had given to her parents for care, leaving her free to start a new life with Sukletin. Their cohabitation marked a turning point, as Sukletin's predatory tendencies would soon intersect with Shakarova's trust, setting the stage for a dark and disturbing chapter in both their lives. Soon after moving in together, Alexei Sukletin and Madina Shakarova began descending into a life of crime, their first ventures involving extortion and manipulation. Sukletin orchestrated a scheme that relied on deception, fear, and calculated cruelty. One evening, he instructed Shakarova to take a taxi from Vasilyevo to Kazan, claiming she would run a personal errand. Once in the cab, she confided in the driver that her husband was unfaithful, planting the seed of a trap that would soon spring. When the taxi driver arrived at Sukletin's home later that night, Shakarova invited him into the house under the pretense of spending the night with her. The driver, unaware of the danger, agreed. At that moment, Sukletin and his accomplice, Renat Volkov, burst into the bedroom, each playing a role in the deception. Sukletin posing as a jealous husband, and Volkov pretending to be Shakarova's brother. They immediately attacked the driver, beating him brutally before demanding money. To intensify the terror, they photographed him in compromising positions and threatened to expose the images to the public unless he paid 200 rubles. Terrified and desperate, the taxi driver complied the following day, handing over the money as instructed. This crime was more than just a simple robbery. It showcased Sukletin's manipulative intelligence, his ability to orchestrate complex scenarios, and his complete disregard for human dignity. Even in the company of Shakarova, he used charm, coercion, and intimidation to bend others to his will, leaving a trail of fear in the seemingly ordinary neighborhoods of Kazan. Shortly after he and Madina Shakarova began living together, Sukletin revealed the darkest side of his psyche to her. He spoke openly about his desire to kill women and consume human flesh, presenting it almost as a twisted ambition rather than a crime. To impress and manipulate her, he told Shakarova about his idols, Jean Bedel Bokassa, the infamous emperor of the Central African Empire, and the notorious 19th century British serial killer Jack the Ripper. These figures, he claimed, inspired him, fueling his fascination with murder, control, and the macabre art of cannibalism. Shakarova, young and impressionable, became both accomplice and witness to his increasingly violent obsessions. Sukletin's first known murder took place in November 1979, though some sources suggest it may have been November 1981. The victim was 22-year-old Ekaterina Osatrova, reportedly a sex worker. Sukletin invited her to his apartment under the guise of a casual meeting, introducing Shakarova as his sister to deflect suspicion. That evening, they shared a meal, and later, Sukletin and Osatrova went to the bedroom together. While he and Osatrova engaged intimately, Shakarova offered her a drink, subtly distracting the young woman. Taking advantage of the moment, Sukletin struck Osatrova on the head with a hammer wrapped in a rag, rendering her vulnerable to the horrors that followed. After the initial blow, Sukletin bound Osatrova's hands with rope and cut her throat. He later claimed that he drank her blood while she was still alive, forcing Shakarova to drink as well. Once Osatrova was dead, he displayed a terrifying ritualistic cruelty, hanging her corpse and mocking her before proceeding to remove soft tissues and eviscerate her internal organs, with Shakarova assisting. The remaining blood was drained into the bath, and Sukletin consumed the heart, liver, and lungs. In a further display of twisted intimacy, Shakarova prepared borscht and pelmeni using parts of the victim's flesh, and the two ate together, while some of the remaining meat was fed to their dogs. The victim's bones were later disposed of under a water tower, or, according to some reports, stored in a barrel, leaving behind a macabre and chilling scene that would soon mark the beginning of their deadly partnership. After the murder of Ekaterina Osatrova, Sukletin continued killing in a disturbingly consistent and ritualistic manner. His method was brutal yet precise. He would first stun his victims with a powerful strike from his hammer or by smashing their heads against a wall, leaving them unconscious or gravely injured. In most cases, he finished them by cutting their throats, though in at least one instance, the hammer blow itself proved fatal. Once the victim was dead, Sukletin and Shakarova dismembered the body, consuming the soft tissues in a chilling display of predation. Shakarova's role, while indirect, was equally grim. She washed the bloodied clothes and Sukletin's underwear, ensuring the traces of their crimes were erased, but she did not participate in the actual killings. The bones of each victim were consistently buried in the same location as Osatrova's, under the water tower or in a barrel, creating a hidden graveyard of human remains. Shakarova also recalled how the couple profited from their horrors. In addition to eating the flesh themselves, Sukletin and she would sell human meat to unsuspecting neighbors under the guise of tenderloin. In her recollections, Shakarova also revealed the twisted psychology behind Sukletin's obsession. Beautiful women, she said, provoked his most malicious impulses, while intelligent women frightened him, stirring a dangerous mix of desire and fear. He would fantasize obsessively, speaking of how he would sexually engage with certain women and ultimately kill and consume them. According to Shakarova, he even attempted to murder her on 3 separate occasions, though for reasons unknown, she survived each attempt. The dark combination of desire, sadism, and cannibalistic impulse made Sukletin one of the most calculated and horrifying predators in Tatarstan, turning every interaction with women into a potential nightmare. In January 1980, though some sources suggest it may have been January 1982, Sukletin committed what is recorded as his second murder. Together with Madina Shakarova, he lured 2 young women under the pretense of celebrating the new year. The night began like any ordinary gathering, but for one of the women, 22-year-old Tatiana Larionova, it ended in unimaginable horror. Sukletin killed her, consuming parts of her flesh in the same ritualistic manner he had practiced before. The second girl, however, he spared. She appeared too thin to satisfy his grotesque appetite. When the surviving girl awoke, Sukletin concocted a casual lie, telling her that Larionova had woken early that morning and left for Kazan, masking the reality of the brutal crime he had just committed. Sukletin's third victim was even younger, 15 to 16-year-old Rezida Galimova. He lured her to his dacha under the pretense of helping her with school problems, a manipulative promise that concealed his true intentions. Once inside, He raped her before delivering 2 brutal hammer blows to her head, killing her instantly. During the attack, Galimova pleaded with Shakarova for help, but she coldly refused, remaining complicit yet passive. After the murder, Shakarova took the girl's sweater, a grim souvenir from the crime, highlighting her disturbing participation in the aftermath of Sukletin's actions. Following the murder of Galimova, Sukletin continued his spree, luring 22-year-old Nadezhda Sidiavina to his house. He involved Shakarova in this act as well, presenting Sidiavina to his mother in Zelenodolsk under the pretense that she would become part of his household. Once again, he killed the woman in his familiar, methodical fashion, demonstrating both the calculated nature of his predation and the horrifying consistency of his rituals. Each victim became another extension of his obsession, a chilling testament to his manipulation, cruelty, and complete disregard for human life. The 5th victim of Alexei Sukletin was 19-year-old Natalia Shkolnikova, who worked alongside his previous victim, Nadezhda Sidiavina. Like the others, Shkolnikova became entangled in Sukletin's predatory world through calculated manipulation. Her connection to Sidiavina likely made her a target, placing her directly in Sukletin's line of sight. As with his other victims, his approach combined deceit, coercion, and the cold calculation of someone who viewed people purely as objects to satisfy his twisted desires, ensuring that she too would fall prey to his deadly ritual. The 6th and youngest victim of Alexei Sukletin was Valentina Elikova, a girl of only 11 years old, though some sources suggest she may have been 12. Sukletin met her in Kazan and, in a calculated act of deception, introduced himself as a distant uncle, a guise meant to gain her trust and lure her into his home. The innocence and vulnerability of the child made her the perfect target for his predatory schemes, allowing him to manipulate her into following him without suspicion. This chilling manipulation set the stage for the horrors that would follow, marking one of the darkest chapters in Sukletin's escalating spree of crimes. Once inside his home, Sukletin's monstrous intentions became horrifyingly clear. He struck Valentina Elikova's head violently against the wall, inflicting grievous injuries, then raped her before ending her life. The cruelty of his actions extended beyond the victim herself. Medina Shakarova, who witnessed the attack, tried desperately to intervene and save the child. Sukletin, however, responded with extreme violence, severely beating Shakarova to assert control and silence any resistance. This moment revealed the terrifying combination of his physical power, sadistic impulses, and the absolute dominance he wielded over those around him, even those closest to him. After the horrifying murder of Valentina Elikova, Sukletin's cruelty did not stop. He ordered Medina Shakarova to kidnap a baby for him, a demand so unthinkable that she immediately refused. Terrified and overwhelmed by the danger, Shakarova eventually escaped, fleeing from Sukletin and returning to her parents' home. Despite having broken free from his immediate control, she carried the heavy burden of silence, never revealing the monstrous crime she had witnessed and participated in indirectly, living with the haunting knowledge of the horrors that had taken place under Sukletin's influence. After Shakarova escaped, Sukletin assaulted the young daughter of his friend Boris. He manipulated the girl by inventing a story about a nephew who supposedly lived in Italy. According to Sukletin, this fictional relative was searching for a young bride, and he claimed he had been entrusted with finding a suitable girl. The tale was entirely fabricated, designed purely to lower the victim's guard. By presenting himself as someone arranging a future opportunity rather than posing a threat, he exploited trust and innocence in the most calculated way possible. The deception demonstrated how easily he could weaponize ordinary conversation to serve his predatory intentions. Soon after, 23-year-old Lydia Fodorova entered Sukletin's life and became his new cohabitant. Described as a heavy drinker, she moved in accompanied by her relative, Anatoly Nikitin. The three of them spent time drinking and holding small gatherings, creating an outward appearance of ordinary social life. But beneath that surface, Sukletin's violent impulses remained unchanged. Unlike Shakarova, however, Fyodorova refused to assist him in harming women. When she realized the danger she was living in, she reportedly threatened to expose him to the authorities. On March 12, 1985, that threat sealed her fate. Sukletin, together with Nikitin, assaulted and beat Fyodorova. She became his seventh and final known victim. After her death, Sukletin attempted to eliminate evidence by burning her clothes. In keeping with the grim pattern of his previous crimes, he dismembered the body. 6 days later, on March 18th, Shakarova returned to Sukletin. Rather than reporting what had happened, she assisted in concealing the crime. She cleaned the room where Fyodorova had lived and washed the blood-stained clothing, once again participating in the aftermath while distancing herself from direct violence. This final sequence of events marked the closing chapter of Sukletin's known killings, though the psychological and social damage left behind would continue far beyond those walls. According to neighbors, Alexei Sukletin never aroused suspicion. To those around him in Vasilyevo, he appeared ordinary, even helpful. He was known as a drinking companion who could lend a hand with practical tasks like fixing a roof or digging potatoes. He recited poetry, entertained guests, and maintained the image of a sociable, hospitable man. In a small community, that reputation carried weight. People saw what they expected to see, a flawed but familiar neighbor, not a predator hiding in plain sight. He openly enjoyed the company of women and appeared comfortable in social settings, further reinforcing the illusion of normalcy. There were unsettling details in hindsight. He reportedly liked to call passing children meatballs, a disturbing habit that, at the time, was dismissed as crude humor. No one imagined that beneath that facade was someone responsible for murder and acts of cannibalism. The contrast between the public persona and the private reality was stark, highlighting how effectively he blended into everyday life. At one point, local police in Vasilyevo did visit Sukletin, but they failed to gather sufficient evidence to charge him. The broader social context of the mid-1980s Soviet Union also played a role. Within official ideology, serial killers were often portrayed as a phenomenon associated with capitalist societies, not socialist ones. As a result, authorities were reluctant to acknowledge patterns of serial violence publicly. Disappearances of women and girls in Vasilyevo were not openly discussed, and information was tightly controlled. This silence created an environment where suspicion struggled to take root and where a man like Sukletin could continue operating without immediate exposure. Lydia Fyodorova's prolonged disappearance eventually drew the attention of law enforcement. Officers visited Alexei Sukletin and questioned him about her whereabouts, but he calmly claimed he had no knowledge of where she had gone. At that stage, there was still no concrete evidence tying him to a crime. He maintained his composed demeanor, relying on the same mask of normalcy that had protected him for years. Not long after Fyodorova's murder, Sukletin made a critical mistake. While drinking with a coworker named Gennady Uglov, he revealed the burial site of Fyodorova's remains. Sukletin appeared confident that Uglov would remain silent. As a guard, he had promised to make a favorable entry in Uglov's workbook, documentation that could help Uglov avoid prosecution under Soviet laws against parasitism, which criminalized unemployment. Believing he had secured Uglov's loyalty through leverage and alcohol-fueled camaraderie, Sukletin underestimated him. On June 3, 1985, Uglov went to the police and filed a report. At first, officers reportedly dismissed his claims, unable or unwilling to believe the scale of what he described. Determined, Uglov shared the story with a friend who worked within the police force, and the information began to gain traction. There is, however, an alternative account of how the crimes were uncovered, described by author Nikolai Modestov in his book Serial Killers, Maniacs and Their Victims. According to this version, after Medina Shakarova returned to Sukletin, the pair resumed their extortion scheme targeting taxi drivers. This time, however, the intended victim refused to pay and went directly to the authorities. When police arrived at Sukletin's residence, They allegedly discovered a passport belonging to one of the missing women and human remains inside the home, immediately exposing the horrifying reality. On June 4th, 1985, Sukletin was arrested. Among those involved in his capture was Nikolai Kolesnikov, a former Olympic weightlifting champion who at the time served as a senior security officer in Tatarstan's Criminal Investigation Department for particularly important cases. The search of Sukletin's property uncovered 4 bags filled with human bones buried in his garden, along with half a bucket of melted human fat stored in a utility room. Grim physical evidence of his crimes. Shortly afterward, Medina Shakarova, Anatoly Nikitin, and Renat Volkov were also arrested, bringing the network of accomplices into custody and closing one of the most disturbing criminal cases in the region's history. In the opening stages of questioning, Alexei Sukletin acted confident and dismissive, telling investigators they would never be able to establish his responsibility for the killings. He appeared certain that the lack of direct evidence would protect him. The breakthrough came not from him, but from pressure placed on Medina Shakarova. Investigator Farid Zajidulin warned her that continued silence could result in the death penalty. Overcome with fear, particularly for her daughter, who would be left without a mother, Shakarova began cooperating. She produced an extensive written statement spanning roughly 70 pages. In her testimony, she attempted to distance herself from the physical acts of murder while acknowledging her involvement afterward. She explained that Sukletin handled the killing and preparation of the bodies, while she assisted in disposing of evidence and sorting through the victims' belongings. Usable clothing and personal items were kept. The rest were destroyed. Her confession provided investigators with crucial detail that significantly strengthened the case. Sukletin was later sent to Moscow for a psychiatric assessment at the Serbsky Center. During evaluation, he displayed no regret. Instead, he rationalized his actions by claiming his victims were immoral and that he had somehow cleansed society. When asked whether he feared divine judgment, he mocked the idea entirely, declaring himself both God and the devil. Yet despite his grandiose tone, he admitted one genuine fear. He did not want to die. Medical experts ultimately concluded that he was mentally competent and fully aware of his actions, rejecting his attempts to portray himself as insane. In an apparent effort to obstruct proceedings, he began confessing to additional crimes that investigators could not verify, complicating the record. He even tried to negotiate with authorities, demanding 50 rubles in exchange for revealing burial locations. On April 18, 1986, Alexei Sukletin was sentenced to death by firing squad. Even while awaiting execution, he continued to display disturbing behavior. During his time on death row, he carved miniature women's shoes out of bread and presented them to investigator Farid Zajidulin, a gesture that reflected the same unsettling theatricality and need for attention he had shown throughout the investigation. On July 29, 1987, the sentence was carried out. Prosecutors initially sought capital punishment for Medina Shakarova as well. However, the court considered mitigating factors, including her eventual cooperation with authorities, expressions of remorse, and testimony that she had acted under threats of violence from Sukletin. She was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison. Anatoly Nikitin received a 15-year sentence for his role in the murder of Lydia Fyodorova, while Renat Volkov was sentenced to 7 years for his involvement in extortion. Shakarova's time in prison was marked by hostility from other inmates, who reportedly gave her the nickname Dynamite Grinder. She was first held in a penal colony in Kozlovka in the Chuvash Republic, where she was attacked by fellow prisoners. For her safety, she was later transferred to a facility in the Plesetsky district of Arkhangelsk Oblast. In 2001, both Shakarova and Nikitin were released after completing their sentences. At one point, media outlets incorrectly reported that Shakarova had died in 2005. Those claims were later disproven in 2008 when she appeared in an interview on the television program City, confirming she was alive. The later lives and whereabouts of Nikitin and Volkov after their release have not been publicly documented. Case 7 in 1972. In the sprawling urban landscape of Moscow, Belov was born into a society that was itself on the verge of enormous political and economic change. His early adulthood quickly became entangled with crime. His first conviction came for theft, a relatively small beginning that nevertheless set him on a destructive path. After being released in 1991, he did not manage to rebuild his life. Instead, he escalated. What began as robbery ended in murder, marking a point of no return. On February 4th, 1993, a court sentenced him to 15 years in a prison in Ulyanovsk. Behind bars, his world narrowed to concrete walls and hardened personalities. Among them a young inmate named Sergei Alexandrovich Shabanov, also from Moscow. The two formed a connection that would later prove deadly. Shabanov, born in 1977, was younger but shared a similar trajectory shaped by violence and instability. Prison became the setting where their partnership took root. Years later, the system that had confined them also released them. Shabanov was granted parole first, and in 2001 Belov followed. Both men returned to Moscow carrying not only criminal records but also a bond forged in incarceration, a bond that would soon manifest in bloodshed. Their first killing as a pair was not random. It came at the request of an acquaintance who wanted a merchant named Alexander Cheresimov eliminated. For a payment of 15,000 rubles, the two agreed. On October 15, 2001, they shot Cheresimov, turning contract violence into their shared enterprise. The murder marked the beginning of a brief but ruthless collaboration, where financial incentive and cold calculation merged without hesitation. Just over 2 months later, on December 26th, violence struck again, this time on Festivalnoy Street in Moscow. Belov targeted a woman returning home from work. The encounter ended with her death. He took her belongings, a handbag, earrings, cash, and even a cake she had purchased. The stolen items amounted to roughly 3,000 rubles. The randomness of the crime, killing for modest valuables, reflected a brutal indifference to human life, where opportunity alone was enough to justify irreversible violence. On the freezing night between January 6th and 7th, 2002, another act of violence unfolded in Moscow. Belov had argued with a 46-year-old man earlier that evening, a dispute that lingered in his mind long enough to turn into intent. Instead of walking away, he followed him through the dark streets. When a man approached a residential building on Dorosnaya Street, Belov attacked from behind, striking him multiple times with a wooden beam. After the assault, he grabbed the victim's bag, which contained a video camera, documents, and personal belongings. The injured man was still alive when emergency services arrived, but he succumbed to his wounds while being transported to the hospital. For years, the killing remained unsolved, just another file collecting dust, until December 2022, when Belov finally admitted responsibility. Violence continued only weeks later. On January 25th, Belov and Sergei Shabanov targeted a woman from Austria in a quiet courtyard on Zelenogradsky Street. The setting was isolated, the attack swift. As in earlier incidents, they took her bag before fleeing. The pattern was becoming clearer. Ambush, theft, escape. Yet their boldness did not diminish. On the evening of February 10th, they struck again, this time on Vyborgskaya Street. The motive was the same, and so was the method. They assaulted another victim and stole a small amount of cash, just 100 rubles and a mobile phone. Unlike the others, however, this victim survived. Her survival proved critical. Authorities consolidated the related cases into a single investigation, assigning the Inter-District Investigative Brigade to pursue the attackers. With her assistance, investigators produced a facial composite. The image was plastered across Moscow and broadcast on television screens, turning the hunt into a public effort. Despite the visibility of the search, the men evaded capture. The posters faded, the broadcast stopped, but the violence did not immediately end. On February 20th, a new act of violence shook the streets of Moscow. Just 2 days later, On February 22nd, Belov and Shabanov struck again at a residence near Klinskaya Street, claiming another woman's life. The pace of their crimes accelerated. On February 27th, near Cherepanov's Passage, Belov attempted to assault another woman with a baseball bat. She fought back fiercely, forcing him to retreat. Only hours later, on Lyapodevsky Street, the duo carried out what would become their final known murder. The killers displayed a chilling lack of fear. They often drove to the scenes of their crimes openly, paying no mind to potential witnesses or the possibility that license plates might be noted. Their victims were typically ordinary people, middle-income residents going about their daily routines. But the financial gain was minimal, sometimes totaling as little as 3 rubles. The acts had become almost routine, as Belov would later confess. After the first corpse, it's hard to sleep, then you get used to it. By this time, panic had gripped Moscow, particularly in the northern administrative district. The media and residents whispered about the so-called Kovrinsky maniac, a figure both terrifying and elusive. Crucially, the first surviving victim provided investigators with a detailed description. Using her account, the investigative team identified the perpetrator as Vladimir Belov, a man already known to law enforcement for prior convictions, confirming that the city's fears were well-founded. When the authorities closed in, Belov realized he was about to be caught. In a desperate bid for escape, he leapt from a second-story window, sprinted to his Opel Vectra, and vanished into the streets. The flight, however, was short-lived. Within 24 hours, both Belov and Shabanov were apprehended. Once in custody, they quickly began giving statements. Belov admitted to all the murders attributed to him, though he consistently attempted to downplay his own involvement. During one interrogation, he chillingly warned that if he were ever freed, he would kill again. "I cannot do anything else," he told investigators, his tone almost matter-of-fact. After thorough evaluations, both men were found legally sane. On December 10, 2003, the Moscow City Court handed down its verdict. Vladimir Belov was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Shabanov received a 20-year term. The Supreme Court of Russia reviewed the case and upheld Belov's life sentence without modification. He was subsequently transferred to the Black Berkut penal colony in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, a facility reserved for the most dangerous offenders. In 2005, the legal proceedings against Belov and Shabanov resumed with a broader scope. During this trial, they were found guilty of 10 separate assaults, including one from October 16, 2001, which had resulted in murder. Shabanov's sentence was slightly increased to 21 years, while Belov's life sentence remained untouched. Despite the court convictions, the true scale of their crimes remains uncertain. Investigators have estimated that the pair may have been responsible for as many as 80 victims, though the court could only definitively hold them accountable for 7 murders. Belov's incarceration continued to evolve. In 2010, he was transferred to the maximum security facility on Ogneny Ostrov, where he remains under strict confinement. Even years later, his confessions continued to expand the known timeline of his crimes. In December 2022, he admitted to a murder committed in December 2002. The courts accepted his plea, adding an additional 19 years to his sentence, to run concurrently with his existing life imprisonment, ensuring that he will remain behind bars indefinitely. Case 8 Mikhail Zyka entered the world on February 18, 1981, in the bustling city of Moscow. His early life was marked by instability. His father abandoned the family when Mikhail was very young, leaving his mother to raise him and his younger sister alone. Seeking a fresh start, she relocated the family to St. Petersburg, where Mikhail would grow up navigating the challenges of a new environment while carrying the weight of an absent father. At school, Zyka quickly stood out from his peers. Teachers and classmates alike noted his keen intellect and insatiable curiosity. He displayed a deep interest in subjects ranging from chemistry and medicine to philosophy, religion, and politics. His wide-ranging knowledge and eccentric personality earned him an assortment of nicknames among students. Some called him Brezhnev in jest, others Satanist, while still others affectionately referred to him as pharmacist or chemist. These monikers reflected both his curiosity about the world and the slightly enigmatic aura he carried. Mikhail's appearance and charm did not go unnoticed either. Among the female students, he was considered attractive, earning him the playful nickname DiCaprio after the internationally famous American actor. He possessed a blend of intellect, charisma, and an air of mystery that made him simultaneously admired and intriguing to those around him. This combination of traits would later play a complex role in the path his life took, shaping both the relationships he formed and the actions that would define his infamy. By early 1995, Mikhail Zaika's behavior began to shift noticeably. Friends and family observed peculiar and sometimes alarming changes. He became withdrawn, spoke in ways that were difficult to follow, and displayed unpredictable moods. Concerned for his well-being, his mother sought professional help, and Zaika was admitted to a psychiatric facility. There, over the course of several months, doctors carefully observed his behavior and conducted numerous assessments. Eventually, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that would require ongoing treatment and medication to manage. He was prescribed antipsychotic drugs, which helped stabilize some of his more extreme symptoms, though the illness would continue to influence his thoughts and decisions in the years to come. Once released from the hospital, Zaika's life took a dramatic turn. The structured environment of school and study no longer held his interest. He abandoned his education and began drifting toward a life shaped by his darker curiosities. Drawing upon his knowledge of chemistry, he sought ways to turn his skills into a source of income. Unable to access formal laboratories or the proper equipment, he improvised in the confines of a small apartment. By late 1995, Zaika had formed a small circle of collaborators, including a 16-year-old boy named Artur Irium. Together, they began producing homemade drugs, primarily in the form of pills, experimenting with different chemical compounds. Zaika's fascination with chemistry extended beyond profit. He conducted his own experiments on plants, creating extracts and testing them on himself in search of a new, potent substance. Nights were often spent hunched over makeshift equipment, carefully measuring and mixing as he sought breakthroughs that might bring him notoriety or simply satisfy his relentless curiosity. Around this period, Mikhail Zaika formed a close bond with a young man named Vladislav Kudryavtsev, who was 20 years old at the time. Like Zaika, Kudryavtsev had a fascination with unconventional philosophies, delving into yoga, occult practices, and even the ideologies of National Socialism. Their shared interests created a strong, if dark, connection between them. The two lived in the same neighborhood and spent most of their time together, especially in the clandestine drug laboratory they had set up. To outsiders, including their families and acquaintances, they maintained the illusion of normalcy, claiming they were part of a music band and that their long hours were devoted to rehearsals and performances. Kudryavtsev, however, carried his own dangerous traits. He had a serious habit of abusing drugs, which fueled his increasingly sadistic tendencies. The combination of Zaika's chemical knowledge and Kudryavtsev's cruelty created a volatile partnership, one that would soon escalate into increasingly dangerous and morally twisted experiments. In the fall of 1997, a troubling turn of events set Mikhail Zaika and Vladislav Kudryavtsev on a deadly path. Kudryavtsev's older brother had been arrested on robbery charges, and the case relied heavily on the testimony of a man named Boris Androshenko. When Zaika learned the identity of this key witness, he proposed to Kudryavtsev that they eliminate him. Fueled by a combination of curiosity, malice, and a sense of invulnerability, the pair began to plan the murder. On September 5th, Zaika lured Androshenko to the Kolomyjai district under the pretense of selling him heroin. Trusting Zaika, Androshenko followed him, unaware of the trap awaiting him. Zaika administered a paralytic drug, claiming it was the heroin, and watched as the man became completely immobilized. After observing the victim's helpless state for a few moments, Zaika drew a knife and slit Androshenko's throat with cold precision. The following day, He poured gasoline over the body and set it ablaze, ensuring that little evidence remained of the brutal crime. By the spring of 1998, law enforcement uncovered the clandestine drug laboratory operated by Zyka and 16-year-old Artur Iriam. Both were taken into custody. Because Zyka was still a minor and had a documented history of mental illness, the authorities decided not to press formal charges against him. Iriam, on the other hand, was placed in a psychiatric hospital, while other members of the group either received prison sentences or immunity in exchange for cooperating with investigators. During this time, Zyka became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the police had been tipped off by a former associate named Borisov, who he believed was secretly working as an informant. Determined to exact revenge, Zyka lured Borisov to an isolated location. There, he crept up behind him and struck him on the head with a rock, knocking him unconscious. With calculated brutality, Zyka then stabbed Borisov to death, adding another chapter to his growing string of violent crimes. In the early months of 1999, Mikhail Zyka was spending time at a nightclub known as Jungle, a popular spot in St. Petersburg's nightlife scene. It was there that he encountered 21-year-old Yevgeny Kondrashov. Kondrashov, who grew up in Murmansk Oblast, had a troubled past with the military. Drafted into the Russian armed forces, he quickly became a target for older servicemen's harsh treatment and beatings. Unable to endure the abuse, he deserted his post and returned home, only to face his father, a naval officer, who handed him over to the authorities. As a result, Kondrashov was sent to a disciplinary battalion for additional training, a humiliating and rigid environment that left its mark on him. After his release from the military in 1998, Kondrashov briefly stayed with his parents, but soon left for St. Petersburg following a heated argument with his father. In the city, he struggled to find stable work, taking up temporary manual labor jobs. As financial pressures mounted, he eventually turned to male prostitution to survive. One evening in August 1998, while at a cafe called Vodali, Kondrashov met 43-year-old Alexander Osherkov, a gay man who offered him a place to stay at his apartment on Mali Prospect. Kondrashov accepted the offer, grateful for the shelter, and it was during this period that he crossed paths with Zyka more frequently. Drawn to Zyka's intelligence and charisma, Kondrashov soon became his constant companion, spending most of his time under Zyka's influence, unaware of the dark path he was being pulled toward. Some months later, Mikhail Zyka and Yevgeny Kondrashov became increasingly immersed in neo-pagan beliefs, developing a fascination with rituals and ceremonial sacrifices. They spent hours reading a wide variety of texts, attempting to understand the mystical and philosophical foundations of their interests. Gradually, they came to embrace a worldview in which Satan was interpreted as a representation of ultimate power, personal freedom, and rebellion against societal norms. This distorted ideology fueled their growing obsession with violence, and soon they decided to put their dark philosophies into action by committing murders together. Their first victim was 17-year-old Valery Vasilyev, a young man who lived in Alexander Osherkov's apartment. Vasilyev had fled from his parents' home due to family difficulties and a poor standard of living. His troubled past included minor run-ins with the law, as well as treatment in a psychiatric hospital following head injuries. On the night of May 5th, 1999, Zyka and Kondrashov lured him to the village of Kamenka under false pretenses. Near an abandoned substation, Kondrashov struck Vasilyev repeatedly with a wooden stick while Zyka administered a paralytic substance to immobilize him. Once Vasilyev was incapacitated, the pair performed a grim ritual. Zyka used a dagger, crafted by Osherkov for ceremonial purposes, to cut a flap of skin from his neck, and together they slit his throat and decapitated him. The act marked the beginning of their series of murders, blending ritualistic obsession with brutal violence. After committing the murder of Valery Vasilyev, Zyka and Kondrashov disposed of the body in a calculated yet macabre manner. They burned the remains on a bonfire, while Vasilyev's head was discarded into a nearby, flooded quarry, leaving little trace of the victim. Zyka, however, retained a grisly souvenir. He carefully placed the flap of skin he had removed from Vasiliev into a perfume bottle and hid it on the stairwell near his apartment. To him, this small vial carried a sacred significance. He believed it contained a fragment of Vasiliev's soul, something he could keep as a token of his ritualistic success. Later that same evening, Kondrashov casually confessed the murder to Alexander Osherkov while they were having dinner. Osherkov dismissed the claim as a dark joke and chose not to report it to the authorities, underestimating the severity of what he had been told. Weeks later, in the early morning hours of June 28th, the two young men returned to Shuvalovskoye Cemetery. They spent hours lighting fires on the graves, drawing occult symbols into the soil, and reciting incantations. Zaika, feeling the pull of their dark philosophy, declared that they needed to offer another sacrifice to Satan to continue their ritual. The search for a new victim led them to the lakes near Suzdal in Vladimir Oblast, just 500 meters from the cemetery. Around 5 in the morning, they found a young man, Vyacheslav Cheklov, asleep on one of the secluded beaches. Cheklov had spent the previous night drinking with two friends and had fallen victim to a bizarre scam. The trio had reportedly been drugged by 3 women who robbed them after slipping sleeping pills into their drinks. Vulnerable and unaware, Cheklov became the next target of Zaika and Kondrashov. As he lay in slumber, Zaika silently approached and, with precise, practiced strokes, slashed his throat 3 times, ending his life without warning. The act was cold and methodical, a chilling display of how deeply the pair had embraced both ritual and violence as intertwined tools of their depravity. After the murder of Cheklov, Kondrashov's appetite for violence did not abate. On July 8th, he set out alone, wandering through Ekaterinski Square, a known gathering spot for young gay men. There, he met Andrei Andy Basarchik, a young interpreter with a friendly demeanor. Basarchik invited Kondrashov back to his apartment on Serebristy Boulevard, unaware of the danger he was bringing home. Once inside, the two shared a meal and wine, chatting as if nothing sinister were about to unfold. Then, without warning, Kondrashov turned violent. He lunged at Basarchik with the intent to stab him, catching his host off guard. Chaos erupted when Basarchik's mother unexpectedly entered the apartment. She confronted Kondrashov, bravely wrestling him away from her son and preventing what could have been a fatal attack. Even though he was thwarted, Kondrashov remained determined to take what he wanted. Brandishing his knife as a threat, he ransacked the apartment, stealing 4 jackets for 1,000 rubles and several items of women's clothing. After the robbery, he returned to Osherkov's apartment. There, he meticulously cleaned himself, changed into the stolen women's garments, and donned a wig, transforming his appearance as part of his continued escape from suspicion and further indulging his twisted sense of theatrics. While Andrei Basarchik and his mother hurried to alert the police about the violent intrusion, officers quickly arrived at the apartment to investigate. As they carefully searched the premises, they came across a small notebook that Kondrashov had carelessly dropped during his frantic escape. The first page of the notebook contained the personal phone number and home address of Alexander Osherkov, revealing a direct connection to another figure involved in their dark circle. The authorities moved swiftly, heading to Osherkov's residence to confront Kondrashov. They arrived just as he was finishing packing a suitcase, ready to catch a train and disappear from the city, leaving no trace behind. The police managed to apprehend him before he could execute his escape. Once in custody, Kondrashov's composure crumbled. The weight of his actions seemed to overwhelm him. In a mixture of fear and resignation, he confessed to the string of murders he had committed, revealing the horrifying truth about the lives he had taken. He also disclosed that Mikhail Zaika had been his accomplice in the killings, providing the authorities with the full scope of their deadly partnership. When Mikhail Zaika heard about Kondrashov's arrest, panic set in. He hurriedly packed his belongings, determined to leave St. Petersburg and vanish from the city before the authorities could find him. Yet, before he could disappear completely, he made the decision to stop by his apartment to retrieve some rare cactus plants he cherished. Little did he know, the police had anticipated this move. As he approached the building, officers waiting in a carefully arranged ambush detained him immediately, ending his brief attempt at escape. Once in custody, Zyka began to speak, revealing that he had participated in multiple ritualistic killings over the past year. However, investigators were only able to find evidence linking him to 2 of these murders. Using the combined testimonies of Zyka and Kondrashov, police soon focused on Alexander Osherkov, charging him with failing to report a crime and with the illegal manufacture and possession of edged weapons. Osherkov, who worked in a factory, had a hobby of crafting knives and other sharp instruments, keeping a small collection at his home. A search of Osherkov's apartment yielded 7 daggers, 4 of which were considered especially dangerous. Upon learning the details of Zyka and Kondrashov's arrests, Osherkov remarked that had Zyka been present at Basarchik's apartment, the crime would likely have been completed without any risk of being caught so foolishly. During questioning, Osherkov admitted only to the charges related to the weapons. He firmly denied any wrongdoing in failing to report the crimes, insisting that he had doubted the 2 young men's claims due to their youth and their obsession with occult practices. His defense portrayed him as cautious and skeptical, refusing to acknowledge the darker consequences of the actions he had indirectly enabled. After a thorough search of Zyka's apartment, investigators uncovered a disturbing collection of materials that revealed the depth of his obsession with chemistry, the occult, and violence. Shelves and cabinets were filled with various chemicals, homemade drugs, and poisonous substances. Alongside, these were weapons of an unusual and frightening nature, including an aspen stake and a bear spear. Numerous letters and notebooks were scattered throughout the apartment. In several of these notebooks, Zyka had meticulously recorded official characteristics for himself and his collaborator, Artur Irium. In these writings, Zyka assumed grandiose and delusional titles. He referred to himself as the colonel of the cult forces, Reichsführer of the Russian Federation, a doctor of chemical sciences, and even claimed to be the grandson of the editor-in-chief of the children's magazine Rzilka. These notes reflected a deeply entrenched delusion, blending a fascination with power, science, and twisted ideology. During subsequent interrogations, Zyka's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He refused to cooperate with investigators, frequently lashing out and making bizarre threats, including claims that he could cast spells on the headquarters of the investigation team. Concerned for the legal process and the safety of both Zyka and the investigators, his lawyers requested a psychiatric evaluation. At the start of 2000, Zyka was transferred to the Serbsky Center in Moscow, where he underwent 2 months of intensive assessment. The psychiatric examination concluded that Zyka suffered from a volatile and severe form of schizophrenia. Experts determined that his mental state at the time of the crimes had impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. Taking these findings into account, the St. Petersburg City Court ruled in April 2000 that Zyka could not be held criminally responsible. He was formally acquitted on the grounds of insanity and committed to a psychiatric hospital designed for patients requiring intensive supervision, ensuring both his treatment and the protection of the public. Once Zyka was confined to the psychiatric hospital, the authorities turned their focus fully to Kondrashov and Osherkov. Their trial opened in the late autumn of 2000 and continued for roughly a month. The case had captured widespread public attention and media coverage, largely because the accused claimed that their actions had been carried out as part of a satanic death cult, a claim that both fascinated and horrified the public. Kondrashov faced charges of assisting in the murders of Vasiliev and Cheklov. His defense attorney argued that he was mentally unfit to stand trial, hoping the court would recognize him as incapable of understanding or participating in legal proceedings. The court, however, rejected these motions, leading Kondrashov and his lawyer to accuse the judicial system of bias, asserting that declaring him sane conveniently allowed his testimony against Zyka and the others to be used in court. Meanwhile, Osherkov raised complaints of his own, claiming that during the search of his apartment, officers had stolen a watch valued at roughly $1,000. These claims, though part of his defense, were largely overshadowed by the gravity of the case. Before the final verdict was delivered, Kondrashov appeared to express some regret for his actions. He claimed that his involvement had been coerced by Zaika, who had allegedly threatened to kill him and his parents if he refused. The court, however, doubted these assertions, noting that Kondrashov's parents had remained in their remote village in Murmansk and had not been in contact with him since he moved to St. Petersburg. In mid-December 2000, the court delivered its judgment. Kondrashov was found guilty of complicity in the two murders and sentenced to 24 years in prison, a decision that reflected both the severity of his actions and the court's rejection of his claims of duress. Alexander Osherkov was found guilty on both counts brought against him and sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, he barely served any time, as an amnesty tied to the 55th anniversary of Victory Day allowed him to walk free almost immediately. In the years that followed, he was again convicted, this time for involving 2 underage boys in prostitution. Vladislav Kudryavtsev, Zaika's final associate, also faced charges at one point, but the court acquitted him due to insufficient evidence. Experts who examined the ritualistic aspects of the crimes believe that Kudryavtsev may have played a larger role than officially proven. It was suspected that he not only knew about the murders, but may have influenced Zaika, who had shown little interest in Satanism before their association. Some support for this theory came from Zaika's own notebooks, where the number 666 appeared repeatedly, not as a mark of devil worship, but as a symbolic reference to King Solomon's gold implements, historically representing earthly power. Scholars also suggested that Kudryavtsev instructed Zaika in the supposed practice of capturing the soul, which explained why Zaika had removed a piece of skin from Valery Vasiliev's neck during the ritualistic killing. During his years in the psychiatric hospital, Zaika's physical health steadily declined. He developed multiple chronic conditions, including asthma, diabetes, and liver problems, which required constant monitoring. Every 6 months, a special medical commission reviewed his condition to assess whether his mental state had improved. Over time, Zaika's psychiatric symptoms became more controlled, and he gradually transformed into a patient who was knowledgeable, articulate, and cooperative, causing no disturbances to staff or fellow patients. By early 2020, the commission determined that Zaika's mental health had stabilized enough to allow him to continue treatment on an outpatient basis. After reviewing the hospital's reports, the St. Petersburg City Court approved his transition from inpatient care, and he was released under the supervision of a registered psychiatrist. During his time in the hospital, Zaika had converted to Christianity and taken up painting as a pastime. Following his release, he continues to follow a strict medication regimen and has become deeply religious, displaying behaviors described as fervent and highly devout. After his release, Zaika gradually built a reputation in certain art circles throughout the city. He became actively involved with the autonomous nonprofit organization Outsiderville, which focuses on assisting people with mental health challenges, offering support through art therapy and encouraging creative self-expression as a tool for social reintegration. Within this community, Zaika developed a distinctive painting style he refers to as outsider art and art brut, concentrating on portraying individuals living on the fringes of society or existing outside conventional cultural norms. By 2023, Zaika had gained enough recognition that reporters from RT sought to interview him. However, he chose not to engage with the media. In exhibition catalogs, curators note that his troubled past, marked by inadequate medical care and prolonged psychiatric treatment, shaped both his life and his work. According to his flatmate Maxim, Zaika shows genuine remorse for his past actions, a sentiment that seems reflected in the intensity and emotional depth of his artwork.